So we've been talking about structures and variables and classes and objects, and we mentioned how we can create structures and make variables out of them. And we mentioned that we can make objects out of classes. Well, how do we actually do that? Well, declaring an object of a class is actually very similar to declaring a variable. Just to give an example here, we can say dim my p as point. And here what we're doing is we're defining or declaring a point object, which is called myP. So myP is the name of the object, and this is going to be an object of the point structure. Now, we can declare objects of a certain type, but we still have to actually create the object, or what we call instantiating them. And this is a little different than just declaring and using our normal variables. In order to instantiate an object, we have to use the word new, and then we have to call a very specific method from that class or the structure. We can do this for structures as well. This method is called the constructor. Now, if you're familiar with Java, then you should already know what constructors are and how they work. It's the same thing in Visual Basic. So just to give the example, or at least a format of it, it would be whatever the name of your class is, and then a pair of parentheses. Now, it is possible that the constructor has parameters. So if that happens, then you would have to include arguments in the parentheses. But the idea with this is each class and some structures would have a method that's just the name of that class or structure, when the purpose of this allows us to initialize the values that are associated with that class or that object. So what we would do is we would create our object, and then we would call this particular method, or call the constructor. Now, calling the constructor is not enough. We have to be able to store the result of the constructor into the object that we've created. So we would have to call the constructor. It's going to pretty much allocate memory for that particular class object or structure object, and then we're going to store that address in the object that we have already declared. So let me give you an example using the point structure. So we can have something like this. myP equals new point, and then in parentheses 100, and then a comma, and then 200. Now, the constructor for the point structure takes two integers as parameters. So these parameters would be the x and y coordinates of the point. So the 100 here would correspond to the x coordinate, and the 200 would correspond to the y coordinate for our point object. So what would happen is when we do new point, whenever we actually have that in our code, that's actually going to create the new object. Just declaring the variable from before does not actually create the object. It just creates a variable that will store the object. But here we will actually create the object and then store it in the myP object variable. We can combine both the declaration and instantiation statements into one line. So before, we would have one line that would declare the variable of some class type or some structure type, and then we'd have another line that would instantiate that object and store it in that object variable. But we can combine them into one line. So if we use our earlier example of the point structure and the object myP, we can have this line. Now it's broken up because it's not all in one line, but that's fine. So we would have dim myP as point, so that's declaring the object from the point structure, and then we initialize it to the new point constructor with the 100 and 200. So this will create a point object. X is 100 and y is 200. So that would give us the coordinates of where this point would be located, or at least the value of that point. And then the resulting object would then be stored in myP. Now let me give you another example. Let's say we're dealing with a button, and we're trying to determine the location of that button. So we can have the following code right here. So BT1 is a button, and remember there is a location property, and this is where we would actually store the XY coordinates. So the way we do that is we can create an object of the point structure. So this will create a point object where x is 120 and y is 35. So that gives us our x and y coordinates, and then it's going to assign that object to the location property of some button called BT1. So before, whenever we were dealing with the X and Y coordinates, we can do it directly in the code, or we can create a point object that would store the X and Y values, and then we would store that object in the location property itself. So how do we use all this in our applications? Well, we can actually use all these statements to create our own tools in our programs. Now, we've already talked about several ways of adding tools into our form, such as dragging stuff from the toolbox, like buttons and radio buttons and checkboxes and text boxes. So we can go into our toolbox on the left side of Visual Studio. But what we're getting at here is we don't have to do that anymore. If you really don't want to, we can just type up code that would create our own tools and then have them appear on our applications. So each tool has its own class. So let me give you an example. So let's say I want to create a label just using code without having to go through the toolbox in Visual Studio. I can have the following code like this. So we see in the first line, we are creating an object of the label class. We're going to call this myLB. I'll probably just say myLabel. And we initialize it to the constructor of the label class. So we say new label. There are no parameters or arguments that we would pass to the label constructor. That's fine. Not all constructors have parameters and arguments. So the first line will create a new object of the label class. And then the next line, we are setting the text property to say I created this. And then the third line is going to set the location of that label. And notice that we are creating a new object of the point structure. So we're going to pass an x coordinate to be 100, and the y coordinate we're going to pass 300. So this will completely work. So this would create a new label object, and this label would appear on our form. Sort of. There's still one thing we have to do here, but what we're getting at with this is what's nice is we can create tools dynamically, and they're independent of the tools that we would add to our form. So that's really neat. So we can add tools as we normally do, but then we can add additional tools dynamically. But here's the caveat with this. Since I said we almost have added them, we still need to include code to actually add it to the form. So we've created it, but we need a line of code that actually says add it to the form. So let me give you an example in this case. So we have an add sub where we would pass the label object, and this is from me.controls. So you would do me.controls.add and then pass the label object, and whenever this line gets executed, then the label would appear in our form.